Morning, everybody. Folks, another minute here to get signed in.
Good morning. Just a quick heads up. I'm going to have to jump off at 11 for another meeting.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Ashley, are we all set? Should we get started here?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you. I will go ahead and call the March 4th meeting of the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee to order. This is a virtual meeting, and we'll have some instructions here on how to join the meeting if you have public comment. Remember to press *9 to raise your hand if you're calling in by phone, and *6 to mute and unmute. Ashley, if you wouldn't mind calling roll.
Okay. Shane Stack.
Eric Dixon, proxy for Shane Stack.
Okay. Sarah Cofield.
Present.
Corey Aldridge. Dory Brownlow.
Present.
Ellen Buchanan. Erin Pehan.
Present.
Jacqueline Smith.
Present.
Chet Krauser.
Karen Hughes, proxy for Chet.
Okay. Juniper Davis.
Present.
Donna Gockler.
This is Neil Miner, proxy for Donna Gockler.
Thank you. Ryan Hammond. Lynn
Present.
Howard. Oh, okay.
Present.
Jeremy Keene.
Present.
Ben Weiss.
Present.
Tiffany Brander.
Present.
Brian Elstad. Bynum Jackson. Eva Rock. Katie Potts.
This is Vicky Cernich, proxy for Katie Potts.
Thank you. And that completes the roll call.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Appreciate that. Our next item is the approval of minutes from the February 4th meeting. Any comments or additions to the minutes? Okay, seeing none, those will stand approved. Item number 3 is public comment. Do we have any public comment on items that are not on the agenda? I see Vince is in the attendees list. Can you promote him to a panelist, please? Thanks, Vince. I assume you're here on behalf of Mountain Line, Corey Aldrich.
Yes, thanks for catching that, Jeremy. I'm here as a proxy for Corey today.
Thanks, Vince. Okay, seeing no public comment, we'll move on to our new business. First item is review and approval of amendment number 4 to the FY 2020-2024 Transportation Improvement Program. Charlie Menifee.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me well? Thank you for the confirmation on that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We can get straight into this. All right, so we're here to go over Amendment 4 of the 2020-2024 TIP. And as a quick overview of this, we have one additional project. We have several project cost changes and a funding update from Mountain Line that I'll go into most depth on. We have Vince on board for any questions that might arise that I might not provide enough detail on if that is necessary. So our first additional project, or the only additional project, is an interstate maintenance project, which is represented in the red line on the map, and it includes epoxy striping on I-90 from mile marker 93.5 to 105.2. And this project total is over $145,000 and will be constructed in fiscal year 2021. So we are now going to get into project cost changes, and these include major modifications, administrative modifications, and project cost decreases. I will call this out as we go through these cost changes. So the first is congestion mitigation air quality funding section, and this includes projects purchase of street sweepers. This was updated to reflect the project closeout adjustment, as these street sweepers were not purchased and leased in fiscal years 2020 and fiscal years 2021. So there is a reflection in that table of a reduction of $700,000 and $900,000. Second project cost change is interstate maintenance, and this is Missoula to Bonner project. The cost was increased in construction of $71,000 to reflect engineers' cost estimates. So the project cost total went up by only 1.6%. This is an administrative modification. The next is National Highways funding section. This is Reserve Street from mile marker 0 to 5.3. It's a pavement preservation, including joint seal and grinding. And this project is an administrative modification that went up by 7.6% to reflect an increase of bids on the slab replacement and traffic control devices in the project. The next is Surface Transportation Program Off System, or secondary. This is the D1 Slope Stability Project. This went through a project decrease by around $900,000 in fiscal year 2021. This was to reflect the latest cost construction estimate. Next is Highway Safety Improvement Program, and this includes two project cost changes. The first one is SF 129 skid treatment in East Missoula. And this project went down by about $8,000. The second is SF 169 Lolo East Missoula Safety Improvement. And this project was closed out and reflected with a decrease of almost $15,000. This is a major modification for under bridge programs, steel bridge rehab corrosion 1, and it was increased in construction engineering by 30%, as 30% of the project is occurring within the MPO boundary. And this was due to an additional bridge inspectors required to cover the many work locations. So this project was increased by around $1.1 million, and that reflects about a 33% increase in project total. So now we're going to get into Mountain Line funding updates. The major thing to note on this is that this update reflects FTA's award of 4 separate grant funds for the Missoula Urban Transportation District. And these will be to replace and purchase buses, associated equipment, and technical support. In total, the grants will support the purchase of 9 battery electric buses, and 3 of these buses will be owned and operated by Missoula or University of Montana ASUM through a subgrantee relationship. And these grants are reflected in FTA 5307 and 5339 funding sections. So just to get into these tables, because quite a bit has changed in them, so we want to go over these somewhat concisely. Mountain Line received a letter from Federal Transportation Administration in late October to reflect the latest carryover funds and allocation for 5307. So those are reflected here throughout the table. And the following updates have to do with estimated obligation of an annual transfer for fiscal year 21 to 24. We also have FY 22 to 24 updates of the carryover, which is announced to the Missoula Urban Transportation District near the end of the fiscal year. And then we have the obligations of the grant funds reflected for in the buses and bus stop amenities projects under purchase of buses. And this is with a total of around $6.4 million, which ups our total obligation for the whole tip segment. So that is 5307. Does anybody have any questions about this table? I know there's many updates and many numbers highlighted in red. Give a brief moment for that. Okay, let's hop into 5339. So 5339 contains updates to both the allocation and carryover as stated in the late October update from Federal Transit Administration that Mountain Line received. And it shows obligation of funds for bus stop and amenities throughout the TIP time period. And this is a huge increase in funding due to the low no-fi grants that they were awarded prior to the TIP time period and obligated throughout this 2020 to 2024 TIP time period. Does anybody have any questions about this update from Mountain Line? We'll give a brief moment for that. All right. So a little background on our public notice. We did follow as our public participation plan designates by submitting a 30-day public notice primarily through Missoulian legal advertisement. We did receive updates from both MDT and Mountain Line after this 30-day public notice was released. So to address this, we hastily updated the materials available that people refer to as reference from legal ads, as well as updated our agenda for this meeting. And staff recommends approval of tip amendment 4 for this tip time period. Is there any questions that I can address or help direct staff towards?
Thanks, Charlie. Appreciate the detailed presentation. Very helpful on the project details. Can we go back to the sweeper funding? I'm curious, since we didn't purchase those sweepers in those fiscal years, does that funding forward shift into future years?
Let me view my table on my other computer. I have 2 computers up. Analyze how that looks. For my understanding, how it looks in the table, and if you pull up the attached draft tip document or change tables document in the agenda, it looks like it just does not pull from the allocation or carryover. So we have more funds available.
Okay, so the funding, we don't lose the funding, it just isn't allocated at this point.
Yes.
So my understanding is that we've been trying to purchase sweepers or lease sweepers, and that just hasn't happened yet. And so we would still be looking to deploy that funding in the near future.
From my understanding, that is the same. Yes.
Yeah, and Jared, just a quick update on that is I think we're getting close. The MDT is just working through the final details on the lease agreements and having their legal review those contracts, and then we should get a chance to review those and hopefully have something in the next, well, not unsure how long that will take, but hoping to continue to move those leases forward. But I will say for the CMAQ funds, because it's a lease and not a purchase, there's not really, we're not going to be spending that $250,000 additional next fiscal year. It'll still stay at that same rate because we'll have a 5-year lease, if that makes sense. So it's not like purchases where we're just deferring a purchase and so then we'll purchase more next year. That cost is going to stay pretty consistent. So there will be some additional CMAQ available in our funding moving forward.
So will we need to do another tip amendment for those sweeper leases?
No, because we should have that shown in our upcoming fiscal years. So in FY 21 and 22 and sort of continuing through 24. So I don't think we'll have to do a tip amendment for those leases to go forward.
Okay, good, thanks. Ellen, you had your hand up?
I'm good.
Okay.
You got answered.
Okay, any other questions on the tip amendments? Seeing none, I think we're just looking for a motion.
I'll move approval of the amendments.
Thanks, Lynn.
Second.
Seconded by Ellen. Okay, I forgot how we're doing this. Let's just do a voice vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Very good, thank you. The motion passes. Thanks very much, Charlie.
You.
And we'll go on to our next agenda item, which is review and approval of the East Missoula Highway 200 corridor plan.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? All right, hi, my name is John Sand, transportation planner with the MPO. I'm here today to present the adoption of the East Missoula Highway 200 corridor plan, which we've been providing updates to this committee on over the past year. So we had legal ads run in the Missoulian through the month of February and up until TPCC in March for notice of the adoption and final comment. Notices were put on the Missoula MPO webpage, social media, Facebook, and then emails were collected during the open houses and outreach. And so project emails went out, and then as well as newsletters and partner newsletters. So just to quickly review some of the feedback we received on the final plan. Still a lot of folks concerned about summer recreation and really would like to see shuttle service, whether that's with Mountain Line or other community groups. It's something folks are really interested in seeing out there. And then Bob Giordano had some great comments from the Missoula Institute for Sustainable Transportation, as well as the Rattlesnake Transportation group. And so he just wanted to emphasize the critical need of roundabouts for safety. That is referencing the roundabout at the westbound I-90 exit out there in East Missoula. And then he just wants to make sure that safe walking and biking networks extend the project length. And then also wanted to just mention how cycle tracks are better for winter maintenance, and he would like to see the bike lanes and Hellgate Canyon be cycle tracks. And he mentioned the shared use path along Highway 200 and the river may be duplicative, but that is presented in the plan that way. Just whatever project comes to fruition first will be an improvement. And some comments about the design of the cycle track being more of a track versus a bike lane, and concerns about barriers and to make it feel more comfortable. So not a ton of comments from the community on this. We did make some updates to the plan from comments from MDT, and that is just including future coordination with MDT on this plan. There's a MDT corridor, everything from moving the bus stops from Speedway to Highway 200 will require coordination and approval from MDT, as well as some updates to right-of-way limitations to making sure there's enough space for the trail along the highway. And then coordination with MDT about the shared use path policy, safety concerns about driveways, and that policy and right-of-way considerations. Next steps for this process, with your approval today, we'll move on to Transportation Policy Coordinating Committee later in March. And then this will also be presented to City Council and the Missoula County Commissioners for adoption as well. Our public comment period was through the end of February, and we have a staff recommendation to adopt the East Missoula Highway 200 corridor plan, and I can answer any questions at this time.
Thanks, John. Any questions or comments from the committee?
Jeremy, while we're waiting for if anyone has comments, I do want to just acknowledge that we have Kate Dinsmore from WGM here, and just want to, on behalf of the MPO staff, thank Kate and her team for all the work that they've put into this. I think we've done a pretty fantastic job of coming up with a really creative, solid recommendation for this corridor, and hopefully this will help move us along towards actually getting it implemented. And they did a really good job of shifting gears like all of our consultants have had to during COVID, and making sure that we still got good engagement and good participation. And I think they've done a really good job of incorporating all of those comments into this design. So we do have Kate here, and I just want to thank her for all the work that they've done on this project.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Kate, and all the staff that worked on this plan. It's really a good plan. I think it gives us a good roadmap for going forward and starting to look at putting some individual projects together and start to implement it. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up from our committee or from the public. Do I have a motion to adopt the East Missoula plan?
I'll move to adopt the East Missoula plan.
Thanks, Ben.
I'll second that.
Second from Neil. Thanks, Neil. Okay, seeing no further comments, let's do a voice vote again. All those in favor, signal aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Okay, motion passes. Thank you very much. Moving on to our third agenda item, update on the long-range transportation plan, revised recommended scenario, and discussion of programs, policies, and plan linkages. Aaron Wilson and Jennifer Wyland.
All right, well, thanks. Hopefully you all are not getting sick of seeing us back here talking about the long-range plan every month. I think this is probably a little bit unusual for an unusual result of COVID and having consultants available every month. So we do have Jennifer here again this month, and I do think it's helpful. We can have these regular updates sort of as we're going and having the discussion we need to have. Hopefully we'll keep this, allow us to integrate comments from this committee and discussion in a way that maybe we wouldn't otherwise be able to under normal in-person circumstances. So Jennifer,
You want me to share?
Yeah, if you want to share your screen.
Sure thing.
So we have kind of a continued update on this project. We're going into our sort of final round of public comments before we have a draft plan. And so this is a good opportunity to update this committee on the work that we've done since it feels like 2 weeks ago. I guess it's been a month now since we last presented, but we've done a bunch of work revising our recommended scenario and illustrative projects based on comments that we received from this committee and TPCC and various other sources. So we want to quickly go over those changes and get kind of any last feedback as we take this out to the public for public review of that draft scenario. And then we want to spend some time. We didn't have a lot at the last TTAC to really dive into additional programs and policies. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking through what other recommendations we want to include in this plan that help us move forward on our goals as they relate to transportation or any other planning work that's going on. And then we'll kind of wrap up with what our engagement activities are for the rest of the month. And then our next steps are getting a draft plan developed and bringing that back for review and final comments and adoption. So still a lot to do, but we're kind of rounding the corner on trying to wrap this process up.
Great. Thanks for that, Aaron. And good morning, everybody. Good to see you all again. We're going to just dive right into changes that we've made to the recommended scenario since we saw you last month. And really want to thank all of you for taking the time to dig into the various lists. Many of you participate in our long-range transportation plan technical advisory committee as well, which was another great source of discussion. So we have made a good number of changes to the recommended scenario in the illustrative list of projects since we saw you as a committee, and wanted to give you just a few highlights of those before we show you the updated version of that recommended scenario and then as Aaron said, see if there's anything else that we need to adjust at this point. I will note that there were a few comments that came from city and county staff just after we had made this whole set of updates. And so we still have those, we are holding them and will incorporate them when we make any changes that come from this current round of public engagement as well. So there are just a few things that I thought I would highlight for this group to show you how some of your feedback has been incorporated. One of the things that is different, if you look at the interactive map or the static maps that may have been included in your packet, we did in finalizing the recommended scenario, we did create a standalone category for bridges. And part of the reason that we did that is just because they are such a different type of infrastructure and such an important type of infrastructure. We had good discussion with all of you about the fact that, you know, for some bridges and some locations, especially the connections into downtown, it's hard to know at this point which option maybe should be recommended versus what should be illustrative. So we did provide a handful of different options. We typically chose one to be part of the recommended list. But again, as we've talked with you about, keeping something on the illustrative list gives us the flexibility to shift things and move things forward as we might need to. So you'll see a handful of new red projects as you start to look at the list again, or to look at the map again. We heard a lot of feedback from this group and from others about the importance of that interchange at I-90 and the importance of really thinking about the Russell Street extension. And so what we did is separate those two projects. We have the I-90 interchange included. It is an illustrative project, but it is included as a separate element from the Russell Street extension, just to really provide some flexibility in terms of how those projects could move forward in the future. So that was a comment from many of you, and we agree that that was a smart move to make. I'll highlight another one that we had some good discussion about with this committee. So in the River Road neighborhood, there was a good suggestion to make a switch and to have Curtis Street be our recommended project and move Johnson to illustrative in keeping with community feedback. And so we have done that. We also added a couple of new projects as illustrative. The Wyoming Connector and the Christian Drive Extension are new illustrative projects that have been added. And then as you were going through projects, you helped us recognize that there were a good number that needed to be removed entirely. And so a couple examples of those are the Lower Miller Creek Bridge, which is one that has some significant feasibility concerns, and it has been discussed multiple times. We also removed a Bitterroot Spur connection. So those are a handful of things that we removed. We did not get rid of very many projects at all, but we also did move some projects to the illustrative list from the recommended in order to really, again, stay within our fiscal constraint. A couple examples there include the Lewis and Clark shared use path and the North Avenue bike lanes. And again, those are still part of the illustrative list, but they did move from the recommended list. We did a handful of other adjustments in terms of line work, some new costing. So we're feeling pretty good about the accuracy of what's included in our recommended scenario at this point. So again, I know this version of the map is always a little bit hard to see. Please do feel free to go to the interactive map, which is linked on the MPO's website, to dig in a little bit more closely to some of these projects. As I mentioned, you'll see a new category of corridor projects, which are bridges, and then we still have our complete streets, active transportation, and safety. So much like we talked with you about at the beginning of February, as we continue to make revisions, we really did try and keep our focus on the ways that this scenario prioritizes strategic and inward growth while still making some of those inner neighborhood and inner regional connections or regional connections that are so important. We wanted to make sure that as we took another look at this scenario, we cleaned up some of the committed projects, but we also made sure that we had a good balance in thinking about some of our complete streets projects that really work for all modes. So making sure that we have projects that are going to support people driving, that are going to support freight traffic and our key commercial corridors, as well as this very strong active transportation network. As we made some of those final tweaks that I described, we continued to look at our scoring related to equity and really keep that focus on equity and affordability as we made a few changes and made some of those last adjustments. So that is the recommended scenario. We also, of course, as I mentioned, we shifted a few things around. We moved a few projects from recommended to illustrative, and had some really good discussion with our committees about what is happening in different parts of the region. So we talked about what's happening up in Grand Creek. We talked about what is happening in the Miller Creek area, some of the connections even out of the MPO planning area. But again, maintain this illustrative list so that we've got that flexibility moving forward and can move projects around as resources and as opportunities become available. So let me pause there for a quick second before we move into the next phase of the presentation. Any questions, comments, or concerns about the newest version of the recommended scenario? And Aaron, please feel free to chime in with anything that I missed there.
I don't think I have anything to add. You know, we did quite a bit of work. We did receive a number of comments and tried to reflect all of those. Again, I think there's still time. If there are tweaks to any of these projects, you know, we still have time to make those. But like Jennifer said, I think we're feeling pretty good about what we have in here in terms of the projects and what's in the recommended versus the illustrative. Something else I think might be worth mentioning related to the illustrative projects, that there are a number of, I think, really key projects that are still shown as illustrative, like that I-90 interchange or the Russell Street connections, that while they're illustrative, they shouldn't be. It doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't focus effort on those. I like to use the example of the build grant projects, sort of that road network west of Reserve Street, that up until we received the build grant, that was an illustrative project because there wasn't identified funding. And so as we move forward with this plan, sometimes those illustrative projects are the ones we need to spend the most time on figuring out how we're going to implement, because they require that infusion of funding that we don't have in our local or discretionary federal funds. So I think that's an important distinction that sometimes gets lost, that illustrative are just the projects we don't think we're going to do, which is not always the case.
Aaron or Jennifer, could you talk a little bit more about how a project like the Miller Creek Bridge fits into that discussion? So is that a project that, because we're taking it off the illustrative list, we're saying that project is not feasible, even if there were funding at some point in the future?
Yeah, I think that is one that has been studied in the past. You know, it's been in the plan for a number of years. It was studied at one time, and there doesn't appear to be a clear path forward to actually construct that, whether we wanted to, or whether we had funding or not. And so it didn't feel like keeping that in there was something we wanted to do at this time. But we could always, you know, bring those projects back if there is value in having it there. But that was one that just felt like the feasibility constraints were high enough that it didn't warrant being included in the long range plan.
Thanks, Ben.
I don't know if that was just an example project, Jeremy, or if you really were asking about the specifics of that one, but there was a feasibility study and an environmental study done that the preferred alternative instead is to widen Miller Creek Road, and the roundabout was built at Lower and Upper Miller Creek to be expanded in the future to allow more lanes to exit from Miller Creek there. And so this was Kevin's recommendation was to remove it from the list. It was because he had led that study and said that that's the preferred alternative we're working towards.
Yeah, I do remember that was the preferred alternative coming out of that process, but I don't know enough of the details to say whether or not the bridge was ruled out because of feasibility, or if it was just cost driven or impact driven to say that the Miller Creek was the first choice in terms of that. So that I guess that was kind of just a question about an example of a project that is being removed from the illustrative list. You know, it sounds like we are keeping a certain number of projects in there that we still see value to those projects, but we just aren't sure about funding or timing.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jeremy. That there are many, there may be other projects on the illustrative list that in 5 years or in 4 years when you do another update, something has changed and either they move to recommended or they don't make sense for the region any longer. But we did, as we've talked about with this group before, we really see a lot of value in keeping the illustrative list as robust as possible until we hit a point where something is just truly not feasible or doesn't make sense any longer. Okay. Anybody else? All right, well, we can talk a little bit more about money and programs and policies, and then certainly come back to this if other questions arise. Just in terms of our next steps with the recommended scenario. So as we're going through the public review over the next few weeks, which we'll talk about, we also are going to start doing a little bit of thinking about near, mid, and long-term priorities, so that when we do come back to TTAC and we've got a draft plan, the recommended projects start to get sorted a little bit in terms of how we might actually start to move them forward and when they might be prioritized for funding. So some more work to come on that front, but getting the list set was the first step. So Aaron, do you want to talk a little bit about the dollar side of things and where we're at now?
Yeah, so if I recall, we talked a little bit about funding at our last TTAC meeting. Not a whole lot has changed since then, but just as a reminder, thinking through, one of the decisions we have to make, the decisions we have to make are not just what projects are we going to fund, but also, where else can we direct those funds and what other types of activities require funding in our long range plan. So those include things like maintenance, transit, and programs, things like Missoula in Motion, TDM programs, emerging mobility type programs that we might want to fund. And so just looking at how our funding is currently allocated, we have a projected revenue of a little over $1.3 billion over the next 30 years, which sounds like a lot, but it's not. That includes all of the revenue sources, including transit and maintenance and capital improvements. About 50% of that is federal funding, and that's including the federal funds that go to state maintained routes, interstate maintenance, all of those kinds of funding. So that's about 50%. The rest of the money in our projected is coming from local sources, like the transit mill levies, gas tax, road district, other types of local funding. Within that, we have that $181 million of discretionary funds that we're saying is sort of what we have for our fiscal constraint, or for picking new projects or funding new projects within that constrained 30-year projection. So currently, we're using that full $181 million for building out projects in our recommended project list. But one of the things we wanted to talk through are other programs and policies and how we might think about that funding. Do we want to shift some of that into other programs that require, and then thinking about what other sorts of policies we need to implement to help move this plan forward, knowing that we've had this discussion a lot and we get asked the question a lot, if we make this investment, are we going to meet our mode split goal? And the answer is always no, that we need these other policies and programs in place if we're going to meet those ambitious mode split goals or even make substantial progress towards them. So that's kind of general funding outlook. We'll continue to revise these and work on details for the final plan, but this is the general framework that we're working under right now.
Great, thanks for that, Aaron. So as we think about that percentage that is allocated toward programs and policies, as Aaron mentioned, obviously there's some flexibility to do a little bit of shifting to put a little bit more money toward programs and policies. But what would be really helpful for us at this point is some feedback from this group around a few of the programs and policies that we see as potentially maybe spotlights for the final plan. What are some programs and policies that really feel like they might be important? So we're going to tee up 3 of them for discussion today, but then certainly would welcome your thoughts and ideas about other programs and policies that feel really important. And as Aaron said, the reason that we want to make this a little bit of a bigger piece of the long range plan is just that recognition that getting to the ambitious mode split goals that have been set is going to take a lot more than infrastructure. And so the programs and policies really take a broad focus. We have a very long list of programs and policies, quite frankly, and they focus on multiple modes. They focus on intelligent transportation systems, on car share programs, on safe routes to transit, safe routes to school programs. And so really trying to think about that broad set that helps to build on what is already happening in the region's transportation system. How do we further enhance access and safety? What are some of the programs that really can change behavior, whether that is through incentives or disincentives, to help people move a little bit closer to the mode split goals? So we are going to talk through the first of these 3 bullets today in terms of a couple of examples, but there are, as I mentioned, a pretty broad set of programs and policies that we're starting to outline. So for example, safe routes to transit and safe routes for seniors, the idea that a safe routes to school program that includes, of course, infrastructure, but also includes education, it includes encouragement. Those can be elements that are built into a broader system of safe routes programming. We talked very briefly at our last meeting about some opportunities for interregional connections. Passenger rail is certainly something that is being talked about in the Missoula region, but there may be a variety of other interregional connections that we want to tee up for study. But I'll go into these first 3 in just a little bit more detail, and we're going to use some case studies as a way to do that, just providing a few examples from other places. So one of the things that several of you have mentioned over the course of our work together is the opportunity to really think about building on some of the work that has already been done and that exists in the region, and specifically some of the work that you all have been doing with a focus on the Mullen area, to think more broadly about how do we establish street types that go beyond functional classifications, and then get really specific about the design standards that the city and county want to use, that you're going to ask private development to use as you move forward with different types of infrastructure. And so an example of a community that has done this is Grand Rapids, Michigan. And there are many, many examples we could pull from here, but I really like the Grand Rapids Vital Streets Plan, because it goes to the level of not only identifying a suite of street types, which are combinations of that functional classification and land use. So really marrying the land use and transportation elements that continue to come up in our discussions. But Vital Streets also goes to the level of identifying modal priorities on each of their streets. So it is a plan that says, for example, and I'm just going to make up what these colors mean, but for example, Fuller is a really important freight connection. This is a place where we're going to focus on operational improvements, where we're going to focus on making sure that freight can move seamlessly. Whereas Knapp, that's a bicycle priority street. This is one that we're going to make sure people feel really safe and comfortable. We're going to focus on the intersections. So going to that level, not only of making the land use and transportation connection, but also of making that connection in terms of modal priority, has been really helpful for Grand Rapids in moving forward with some of their street design. So the other piece of Vital Streets that is really useful in my mind is the fact that they have specified what are the elements of their different street types, what are they looking for in terms of design standards, and getting really clear about what people should expect to see on different parts of the network. So this is something that, again, has come up in multiple discussions and could be a really valuable program for the region to move forward. Erin, anything you want to add on that one before we go on?
Nope, I think that's it's an idea that I think we've been toying with for a while, and like I said, with the Switipcane master plan, have started to try to implement this, and with the build grant, and so extending that to the region as a whole is just a way to increase the predictability, not just for public improvement projects, but for private development as well, knowing this is what the kind of facility that we're going to want designed, and getting that up front. I think I saw the quote somewhere about this strategy is the measure twice and cut once approach, where you get your ideas set up front so that when you go to design the project, everyone's more or less on the same page, and we don't come back redesigning projects over and over again when we're at that phase where we're trying to get them constructed. So adding that predictability and hashing out the details early on, so that when we get to a project, we're moving forward more efficiently. feels like a valuable way to implement our goals.
This is something that I'm really interested in within Missoula city limits because we're seeing some inconsistencies in the way that streets are currently classified. And we could take the approach of just going through and kind of cleaning it up based on our current engineering definitions. But this is a much more holistic approach that I think could have a larger impact at the end of the day.
Mhm. Yeah, that's Jeremy, as we've seen other cities and cities of all sizes, right, do this. That is exactly what they're looking for. Functional classification is just it's a pretty rough way of articulating what a street is supposed to do. But when you start adding the land use components to it, it really gives you the ability to be finer grained and to focus in different ways on the elements that are most important.
Ben, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to also voice my support for a program like this. It's something that I attended a webinar about. I believe Phoenix and Des Moines were the two spotlight cities that had done something similar. And it's something that I think we could do some high level planning to set those expectations ahead of time without designing entire corridors and then having plans potentially sit on a shelf for a long time, so that we're just, again, creating expectations so that when we go into the project level, we've already kind of established what the goals of the project are. And I like that approach a lot.
Great. All right, I'll move on. Anybody else on this one? Okay, I'll move on to the next, and then we can, of course, come back. So the second is really a combination of program and policy. And this is the idea of moving forward with the next steps for the transportation demand management program in Missoula. So you've got a great education and encouragement program in Missoula in motion. You have some strong regulations in place, or the start of some strong regulations in place. You've got a great planning foundation. And so we really like Eugene, Oregon as an example of how we can take transportation demand management to the next level. And so I'll highlight a few of the outcomes that are included here. What you're seeing on the screen, these are the desired outcomes for their TDM action plan in Eugene. And much like in Missoula, the city of Eugene set really ambitious mode share goals. They have a strong planning foundation. They've got a Vision Zero action plan they're trying to work toward. They've got a transportation system plan, and they've got a clear climate action plan that is directing them to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. So with that policy or with that plan, those plans adopted, it gave them sort of the legs to stand on, I guess, in terms of taking the next steps. And so there are a handful of next steps that they are pursuing. One of them is a focus on really updating the transportation demand management policy and the traffic impact analysis policy to help make the process for development really clear and simple. And so as they think about doing that, there's a handful of elements that they're moving forward. For TDM action plans, which is part of their TDM policy, they are requiring developments and employers of a certain size to prepare, to implement, and to monitor TDM plans. So that is really kind of taking the next level and saying we are holding you accountable for hitting your goals. On the traffic impact analysis front, they have started to move toward more of a multimodal level of service approach. So they are going beyond just vehicle level of service as they try and understand what proposed developments impacts are going to be. They also have included review of walking and biking improvements and connections to nearby networks as part of what is required in a traffic impact analysis. And I think that network connection piece is a really interesting one in terms of some of the opportunities in the Missoula region as well. They also have included safety review as part of their TIA. And so that means that not only are they looking at crash history sort of right in the area that development might be happening, but they're also looking at intersections nearby to understand the infrastructure that might be needed to really create, again, that safer network. So those are elements of what they're doing. They also, I mean, much like you all have talked about, really looking for ways that development can help to implement some of the multimodal projects that have been on the books for a while. There's a lot of work, of course, in their TDM regulations and policy around continuing to expand options. So as a development is coming in, what are the options that are included in that development? Is there bike share? Is there bike parking? What are the incentives that encourage people to explore different modes of transportation? And then really setting forth a menu for developers. And this one I think is something that we often hear developers asking for, right? Like, I want to do what you want me to do, but I just need a little bit of flexibility in how that happens. And so really setting out the menu to help give developers the certainty about what the process is, but also that little bit of flexibility to be creative and to do something that really makes sense for them and for the system. So those are a few of the elements that Eugene has been moving forward, and in conversations with the MPO staff, it feels like there's a lot that we could build on here as we include this in the long range plan for Missoula. So I'll pause again for a second. Aaron, you want to add anything on this one?
No, it feels like, again, we're at an opportune time in Missoula. We've started having these conversations where we've had them to some degree on individual development projects. It's come up in a lot of different ways. And so it feels like an opportune time to develop a set of recommendations. So then when we are updating our code, and when I say we, not the MPO is updating the code, but that when the city or the county go to update zoning codes or development codes, that we have a solid set of recommendations in place that can feed into that and say, here's what we want to achieve, and sort of have that groundwork already laid. Again, just knowing that building the infrastructure is often not enough if we're going to achieve our goals, that you have to have all of those other components that are supporting use of that infrastructure and highlighting it and making it as easy as possible. That's really critical for achieving our goals. So that the idea would be to try to start to lay the groundwork for this and move us forward. And then I guess the only other piece is that some of our transportation options, like transit, for example, with passage of the mill levy in November, and expansion of transit service to nights and weekends and holidays is suddenly making transit a viable mode in a way that, not that it wasn't before, but it's sort of expanding it as a viable mode for sort of living more car free, or you have that option available at the times that you would need it if you're not in a 9-to-5 job, or to do errands and other things. And so transit service is really expanding in a way that I think makes some of this, and then the emerging technology that we're seeing and mobility options, that there's a lot of interest in that. And so all of those things could converge, and we want to be ready for it. And so having this stuff established ahead of time is going to be really critical, so we're not reacting, that we can sort of leverage all of those things in a way that helps us achieve our goals.
I like the menu approach. I think it gives us an opportunity to develop some incentives that then developers can choose between different options. Where does parking fit into all of this?
Great question. So where does parking fit in? I would say, and when we think about parking management, so in terms of how Eugene is managing parking, I can't speak to that specifically. I know it is part of their TDM and TIA policies to look specifically at parking, but I would say it might be possible within the long range plan. We could handle parking in two ways. We could have a separate program that really focuses on taking a close look at parking, the demand and the supply, and right sizing in some ways, exploring shared parking models, thinking about a variety of different approaches, or you could wrap it in as part of a TDM action plan. So we could take it in either direction, Jeremy. It is something that is on our list as an important opportunity for the region. It certainly plays into affordability. It plays into how we're both incentivizing and disincentivizing people to drive as well. Do you have thoughts about what would be most useful for you in terms of how to use it?
No, I don't have any brilliant ideas. I think that parking is a component, and going back to the idea of a menu, if you can provide options that allow for say, a reduction of parking if you do other things, those could be good incentives.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great.
Yeah, and I really see parking, you know, if we're wanting to think holistically about transportation and multimodal travel, that just like vehicles, single occupancy vehicles or carpool are sort of one option along a spectrum of different mobility options. Parking is one way to mitigate the impacts of trips. That is, you know, so it could be included in that off menu of options, that providing parking is one way that you can accommodate the impacts of new or redevelopment, and having it put forth that way, that it's not, you know, we require parking and vehicle stuff and then all of these other things are extras, that we require mitigation of transportation impacts, and parking is one tool in our list of strategies. To me, feels like the more appropriate way to approach transportation holistically and having that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Anybody else have questions, comments, or thoughts on this example? All right, let's do one more then. So this is more of a policy example, but filters into programs as well. And this is an example from Seattle. Seattle developed a new mobility playbook a handful of years ago, probably 2.5, 3 years ago at this point. And we have been working on something similar as a component of the long range plan. And several of you provided input to that a little bit earlier. We're calling it an emerging mobility playbook, and it will be a component of the final plan. So part of what is, I think, really interesting and valuable about the approach that Seattle has taken is that they are recognizing that mobility is changing quickly. They're recognizing that transportation trends are something that we can follow, we can try and get ahead of, but we want to put ourselves as cities, as regions, we want to put ourselves in a position that we are not having to only react, that we are setting the framework for how we want private mobility providers, how we want emerging technologies to interact with the rest of our transportation system and with our land uses. And, you know, I think this is a tough one for cities to be ahead of, because it is very easy to have a private provider come in and say, hey, I've got this brand new thing. Last week it was dockless e-bikes, but don't worry, this week it's scooters and they're great. Trust us. We won't take over the right of way. It's going to be good. And so having the new mobility playbook in place has given the city of Seattle the opportunity to, again, set the ground rules for how they're going to engage with private providers, and has given them the ability to outline program requirements in ways that really center equity, has given them the ability to manage the right-of-way and to enforce the ways that private providers are using the right-of-way, and enable new mobility and emerging mobility to be part of the system that the city is trying to create, as opposed to just something that shows up one day and doesn't get integrated. And so in doing that, I mean, there's a lot that is included in this playbook, but there's an articulation of some trends, and there are the principles for new mobility that really guide the way that the city is approaching thinking about any type of new mobility that might come. So those principles are particularly important, but then also they articulated their sort of 5 big moves, or their 5 plays, to talk about how they are going to approach working with private providers, how they're going to approach new technologies, whatever those might be. And so, you know, they focus on ensuring that new mobility is delivering a fair and just transportation system. One of the ways that they have done this is that when, for example, the new scooters came in, which is pretty recent in Seattle. They said no to scooters for a very long time, but they have been very clear with providers about areas of the city that need to have scooters, even if it doesn't pencil for the providers. So focusing on some of our communities of color, lower income neighborhoods, to really ensure that everybody has the opportunity to use new mobility services, especially where they're most needed. There's been a clear focus on, the second play focuses on a safer, more active, and people first uses of the right-of-way. And part of this is around managing the clutter that we often see with new mobility devices in the right-of-way. So That is about being really clear with providers about where they can park, what the enforcement is going to look like, what the expectations are in terms of maintenance as well. The third play focuses on data. And this has been really important to the city. As you all know, when you're working with private providers, there is sometimes a reluctance to giving the data that is going to help you as a city, as a region, as a county, manage what is happening in the space that you are responsible for. And so the city of Seattle has built a pretty robust data management program and has been very clear about their expectations for the data that they are going to receive. So that is their third play. The fourth play kind of touches on that, but then again is about putting the systems and processes into place so that it's very clear what the rules of engagement are, that it's really easy to take a plug and play approach if you are following what the city has laid out. And then the fifth is to really think about how they're building the infrastructure inside the city. So the people capacity to be able to both anticipate, but then also leverage the innovations that are coming. They don't want to be in a position that they're always saying, no, sorry, we can't engage with you right now. We can't deal with that right now. So their fifth play is really around thinking about the ways that they reshape themselves to be able to support and engage with new options that come. So that's just kind of a quick overview of some of the ways that cities are starting to think about setting those ground rules. Again, that is something that we have been developing for you all as well. And I would say we could make that one of our upcoming discussion topics as well. But comments, questions about this?
All right, couldn't unmute. Ben?
Thanks. This I think would be very helpful. But one of the things, we were approached by a few of the companies a couple years ago and worked pretty hard at establishing some ordinances to help manage this. And we looked at our peer communities and really wrote what I thought were some best practices into the design ordinance that council ultimately rejected. And one of their reasons was that our infrastructure is not adequate for especially the small wheels of scooters. They felt like our roads are not in good enough shape to safely authorize new mobility devices for people who are not experienced. And so to me, I guess there's more than any of these, putting the systems in place to ensure good public-private partnership with a new mobility company is ensuring that we actually get maintenance and our infrastructure up to a standard that that people will feel comfortable authorizing these. And so I think that some work needs to be done bringing people along. Yes, it would be great to establish a new mobility playbook, and these options are just going to change and expand as technology improves. But I think there's some other pieces that we need to bring up to speed also, and we need to be considering that if this is something that we want to highlight and move forward, there's some ground level pieces that need some addressing as well.
That's great. That's a really good point, Ben. We can, you can put all of the policy framework in place that you want to, but if you don't have the maintenance dollars or the infrastructure to support, for example, safe uses, then you're just going to be stuck in the same situation. So that's a great addition. Thank you.
And I don't mean that as a way to say that I don't want to pursue this. It's rather I want to make sure that we get there so that we're not left behind by these new mobility options.
Yep, great. It's a both and.
So when you do agreements with a private vendor to come in and provide things like e-bikes and scooters, can you get revenue from that could go into maintenance work?
Yes, and we had written that into our ordinance, Jeremy.
Anybody else? Okay, so those are just a few of the many things that we're starting to think about. It sounds like there is value in these three spotlights in particular, and then We are also asking for public input around a slightly broader set of programs and policies to get a sense of what people are hoping to see. So if you've got programs and policies that you would like to see in the long range plan, please certainly send those our way. We are still collecting ideas and then starting to shape them into what makes the most sense for this region. So then, what comes next? We are, as of the beginning of this week, we kicked off what is our last, not our last, our second to last, I guess, round of community engagement. And this round focuses on preliminary recommendations. And so what we're engaging with people on at this point is the recommended scenario that we just shared with you. So that updated scenario. We are asking folks, how well does that meet their needs? Does it build on what they told us in December and January? And are there particular projects that are most important to them within that scenario? So that's one element of what we're asking people right now. As I just mentioned, we're also getting some feedback on programs. And then the third piece of a very short online survey that we have is inviting people to tell us how they would like to see dollars allocated. Does the split that Aaron shared with you a little bit earlier make sense, or are people hoping to see more dollars directed toward maintenance, for example, and less dollars directed toward new projects? So that is part of what we are asking folks about. We've updated our website. Again, we've got a short online survey. We are meeting with a variety of groups. We had the opportunity to spend some time with the planning board on Tuesday night. And then we are hosting 2 virtual open houses a little bit later this month as a way to kind of wrap up this phase of engagement. So those are on Wednesday, March 24th. And that is going to be in the evening from 6 to 7:15, and then Thursday, March 25th, we're going to do a lunchtime open house. And those will be the same content at both, so folks are invited to attend whichever works the best for them. We've also got a postcard that is going out. We are providing some printed materials again at a few locations, such as the food bank, as a follow-up to what we did around the scenario engagement, and then are working on social media, getting things out to partner newsletters, and just making sure that folks know they have the opportunity to provide input. So again, that is kind of our second to last public input point. The last point will be around review of the draft plan. So our intent is to release a draft for public review at the very end of April to provide an opportunity for folks to chime in on the plan in May, and then ideally come back to you in June for adoption of the plan. So that is what comes next. Aaron, anything that you want to add on that front?
Only that if there are other opportunities for us to come engage with committees, or we'll be sending out announcements this week and next, or just emails and newsletters and other things to get people engaged. But if anyone else has committees or other things that we can come and do sort of brief updates, maybe not as in-depth as this, but just giving kind of a brief update and engaging with those committees, that would be something we could do as well.
Great. All right, I will stop sharing. Any final comments or questions for today?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jennifer and Aaron. Great work on this. I really appreciate seeing the examples of other places and what they're doing. I think that's really helpful as we think about how Missoula grows and evolves into a different kind of transportation system in the future.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Okay. We have one item of old business. We'll try to wrap this up by 11:30. So we have the update on the PL fund distribution formulas and potential impacts of the 2020 census on Montana's MPOs. Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. And let me get a PowerPoint pulled up. I wasn't expecting us to have time. We had close to a 2-hour conversation with the planning board on the long range plan Tuesday night. So, but I'll get that pulled up here. And we'll come back to this. So I'll try to keep this really, really brief. I think it will be good to come back to it in June or July when we're working on the draft unified planning work program, because that is what sets our budget. And I think that is a really good time to be thinking about sort of our outlook in terms of what's going to be available for our PL funding. But let me just see if I can share my screen here. All right, can everyone see this okay? So this is kind of just a really rough overview, but we wanted to present in what both TTAC and TPCC were interested in when we had some conversations. I think it was back in maybe November or December, was getting an outlook on what happens with the census and potential new MPOs, and what does that mean for our outlook on our transportation planning funds that we get to do things like updating the long range plan or the Highway 200 corridor study. And so this is really just kind of a high level look at what the PL funding is, looking at the federal and state process, what our Missoula allocation is, and then trying to think through what the impact of new MPOs might be, if any. Although we expect, I would be shocked if Bozeman is not a new MPO in this census round, but that remains to be seen. So just looking briefly at the allocation process, and I'm by no means an expert on this. So if Ryan is still on the call, or Vicky, feel free to weigh in with any additional details that I miss. But essentially the planning funds are a set aside from all of the other, there's a set aside from other transportation infrastructure funding. So a certain percentage of that gets set aside for planning purposes through the MPOs. That funding then gets distributed to a state DOT. The state is really responsible for coming up with that distribution formula. It ends up being a collaboration. So the state and the MPOs need to agree on that. And we've had a formula in place in Montana for a number of years. I don't know that has changed much. But state MPOs come up with that distribution formula of how those PL funds get distributed amongst the various MPOs, which Montana has 3. That distribution formula is approved by FHWA. And then from there, the state distributes those funds to the MPOs. They get programmed through the UPWP and then are programmed into those specific planning tasks, or paying for things like the MPO staff, like myself and John and some of our other administrative functions that are necessary to have a well-functioning MPO. So in Montana, or the distribution to MPOs, as I mentioned, the state distributes those, and in that formula consideration, that negotiation between the MPOs and the state DOT, the things that have to be considered include population, the status of planning, air quality attainment, the metro needs, or any other factors as appropriate. In Montana, one of the agreements that we have in our PL funding is that the MPOs have generally all agree, and this is something that happens every year when we adopt our UPWP and is part of MDT's distribution letter, is that we agree to essentially send back 13.242% of our PL funds to MDT for statewide and small urban area planning. But the caveat to that is that MDT also covers the local match on our PL funds, which would be 13.42%. So in some ways, that's a wash for the MPOs, that we're not required to cover the local match, but we also agree to provide that 13% back to MDT for some of those statewide planning purposes, which really does help those smaller communities or smaller urban areas that are not MPOs and would not otherwise be receiving PL funds. So just as an example, in our FY21 allocation letter, we had our estimated FY21 PL allocation. Then there are often corrections or releases. So this release from FY 2019 are funds that we had programmed in the UPWP but didn't expend in that fiscal year. And so that often happens with some of these contracts where we get it into the UPWP, but maybe we don't actually get that project up and running until right at the end of that fiscal year, and we're not actually spending those funds until the following years. So there are typically those releases. There are sometimes corrections in terms of what funds were actually available, since we're moving from an estimate to an actual allocation. And then we have our unobligated funds. So those are our PL funds that have been previously allocated to the Missoula MPO, but were not programmed into a specific project. So that gives us our total PL funds available. We have our transfer to MDT for statewide and small urban area planning, and that is what gives us our available PL funds. So this is an example just from the last fiscal year. So that gets us to what happens with a new MPO, and sort of immediately the first impact is that we have an additional MPO that is going to be drawing from those statewide the total amount of planning funds that are coming into the state. Again, that is based on a percentage of the total transportation funds that we receive. So unless our overall amount of transportation planning funds goes up as a state, we are unlikely to receive additional PL funds. So there's a factor there in terms of how much PL funding is coming into the state. And then we have our, so that's our total state apportionment, which again is partially related to how much Montana is growing versus the nationwide growth. I believe currently Montana is a minimum apportionment state. So I think we'd have to grow pretty substantially to start getting more transportation funds, or something would have to happen in the federal legislation to give us additional transportation funding. So then the other factor, since we do have a population-based formula in Montana, is that the growth of Missoula versus the other MPOs is the other factor that might affect how much our PL funds are decreasing or increasing. So those are sort of the three elements that are going to affect how much we have available in the coming years once we have a new MPO established. The caveat there is that it's probably at least 2 to 3 years before the census numbers come back and the new MPO is formed. It takes some time. We still don't have those final census numbers. Then there needs to be work, I believe, with FHWA to set that urban area for that may match the census urbanized area, but it's not always exactly one to one. So there's some work that needs to happen there before that any new MPOs are receiving a PL allocation. So that is kind of a quick overview. Again, there's a lot of things that are going to factor into how this affects us and what our planning funds are moving forward. At a staff level, we're assuming that this is going to decrease our PL allocation, just that that having a new MPO drawing from that same pot of PL funds means that you're just dividing the same size pie in multiple different, with more people getting a slice of it. But a lot rests on what happens at a national level in terms of infrastructure funding, that if there are substantial increases, that could mean an increase in PL funds. And so the impact we would face could be lessened if that happens. Ryan or Vicky, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add or correct anything that I've stated incorrectly on this.
No, I think you did a really great job, Aaron, because there's a lot of moving parts and they tend to be a little confusing. I would definitely venture on your caveat on that slide that it'll be closer to 3 years as opposed to 2.
Great, thanks, Vicky.
I agree, and also echo the sentiment, Aaron. I think you did a good job here. I think that you said this yourself, but I guess the good news here is that absent changes to the structure of the program, PL funding will grow with the overall program, but that probably will not be more than what, as you put it, you'll be left with after sharing a more or less equally sized pie, but with more takers. So yeah, there's kind of pressures moving in opposite directions there, but one is stronger than the other. The only other thing I'd point out is the funding allocation that the state and the MPOs have agreed to is not static, and something like, on a percentage basis, Montana's MPOs are going up, 33%, assuming Bozeman. And so that's a terrific opportunity to make sure that everyone is still comfortable with that formula. That doesn't solve everyone's problems, but I guess that would be the only other thing that I'll throw out there for you all at the MPO and state levels to consider. And along those lines, I guess one more thing. And Aaron, I think the flow chart that you shared a few minutes ago came from this document, I believe, or, is one of the things in this document, but there's a pretty good survey that FHWA put out. Let's see the date on it. Let me pull it up here. 2015, so relatively recently. That is again, kind of a survey of how different states approach this PL distribution. And like a lot of federal rules, certainly in the planning space, there's, I think, sometimes a surprising to MPO's level of flexibility and variety out there. There's a lot of different ways that states and MPOs can approach this, and just again would not take as a static assumption that the current formula has to stay that way forever.
Ryan, where is that agreement done? Is that something that the legislature does?
Well, I don't know. Vicky might be able to answer that question better than me. Vicky, do you have any idea would the legislature get involved in this sort of?
Not at all. Nope.
I mean, the Transportation Commission, I assume, would want to be involved in something like this, but I doubt it'd go farther than that.
And I would imagine that the Transportation Commission would be, I'm stammering now. I don't know for sure that. Yeah, I mean, I guess the Transportation Commission, it would be presented as an item that mostly for their approval before it went to FHWA to approve the formula.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, again, how, not to put you on the spot, but does anybody on the call know, because I know I don't, when the last time this formula was actually analyzed and formally approved? I mean, certainly longer ago than I've been here, but I don't know how much longer in the past it stretches than that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm going to venture a guess the 90s.
Yeah, so again, this is a good opportunity to take a fresh look at it, but even without the additional MPO, it might be worth cracking open and seeing what's in there. And again, along those lines, I don't know if there's a good way for me to share this in Zoom. But if you want to look up this document, again, it's publicly available, and it's just entitled Review of State DOT Approaches to Distribute Federal Metropolitan Planning Funds. And Aaron, if you and I can touch base on this after, and if you want to share a link with folks. But
I'll get it updated.
Again, just nice. Okay.
Before we run away, I have a correction to make. I lied. It wasn't the 90s. It was reevaluated at the last census when we got all those numbers. So it was 2013.
Great. Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Thank you. Ben, you have your hand up?
Yeah, maybe Aaron mentioned this and I missed it, but why, if our MPO numbers, if they increase by 33%, or if Helena becomes one and it's 66%, wouldn't it make sense that we would get a larger federal allocation for planning? And if not, why not?
Well, okay. I mean, this is a statutory item. So, I mean, this isn't something FHWA enacts as policy. So it's kind of a call your congressman type of response, which I know isn't very satisfying. I think partly it's that, MPO urban area populations are growing everywhere in the country. So it's not by number of MPOs, it's urban area population. And so while Montana's urban area population is growing, so is everyone else's. And, there will be more MPOs because there will be more urban areas that cross the threshold. And I think this is, we were talking before about how the census, and this doesn't impact FHWA definitions. It could someday, but it doesn't necessarily. But anyway, I think that's maybe part of the motivation behind the Census Bureau kind of coming up with a new definition of what an urbanized area even is. because as more and more urbanized areas are born, it might make sense to, change what we actually mean by the term. Otherwise, we're just going to have a lot more urbanized areas. So if if that principle were to be applied to FHWA funds, unless we're just going to, add more and more planning funds to the overall highway program, which again, you could argue is the right thing to do. But absent that, if we keep the same takedown from the overall program, there's just more urbanized areas everywhere in the country. And so Montana, I think, has it's an even more acute issue here because Montana is already a minimum allocation state. But it's still going to be true to some extent everywhere. And the two solutions to that problem is just Congress increasing the takedown for PL funds, or we make the threshold for urban areas higher so that there are fewer people drawing on that money. And either approach has its challenges, but I guess that's the best I can do to answer your question, Ben. I mean, it is a good question.
Yeah, that makes sense, Ryan. I guess I'm not familiar with demographic changes everywhere. I just feel like I see articles how there are a lot of urban areas that are shrinking, like in the Midwest and the Rust Belt and things like that. And so I thought that maybe it would be balanced out by the growth in Western states and that we'd be able to get a little more of the pot. But no, you're right. Everywhere is kind of urbanizing.
Yeah, and again, especially if you consider just the total head count, not necessarily the number of areas over the threshold. I mean, and again, you can consider, even states only slightly bigger than us, if they've got 7 MPOs and they're adding an 8th, that's less of an impact than a state that already has so few adding just that one more. And so there are an array of factors that make this more of a problem in Montana than it would be other places in the country.
I guess my question then to Aaron is, if we're anticipating a 33% reduction in PL funds in the not too distant future, does that impact your ability to carry out your federally mandated duties of the long range plan updates and things like that?
Well, it's certainly not going to help, but we have that requirement, and there's a number of ways. I mean, we'll figure out a way to continue to carry out planning and doing good work. We'll just have less money to do it.
Well, thanks for the discussion on this. I think this is something that we have a little bit of time to think about and prepare for, and we want to watch closely what's happening. So appreciate you being on top of that.
Yep.
We're at 11:30 here, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us wrapped up. So any final announcements or closing comments from the committee? Okay, seeing none, without objection, we will be adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.